People ask me how a man spends 7 years chasing a fleet he doesn't want to catch. I tell them, carefully. You learn their fuel burn rates. You note which ships go dark during the Vencall equivalent of a funeral. You file your intercept projections 3 days late and blame orbital drift, and nobody checks because nobody else in the Consolidation Bureau bothered to learn the math. My name is Dale Corrin. I hold the rank of Warrant Officers, Remnant Pursuit Division, assigned to the tracking and interdiction of what the Bureau officially calls the Vencall Hostile Column, a chain of 11 crippled colony ships strung between 2 dying stars at the edge of the Cassivar Reach. I have held this posting for 7 years, 4 months, and 16 days. I am 41 years old. I have a daughter I haven't seen since she was 9. I have a service record that reads as efficient and unremarkable, which is exactly how I wrote it. The Cassivar Reach is not a place people choose. It is a wide band of deep space between the Bureau's outer expansion frontier and the silence beyond it. The kind of territory that shows up on navigational charts as a featureless gray and earns exactly 2 lines of annotation. Low stellar density, negligible resource value. It is cold and quiet and very still, and it has the quality of a place that holds whatever you leave in it without complaint. I have spent 7 years in a monitoring station on the Reach's inner edge, watching 11 ships that became 8 ships that are now, depending on how the next 48 hours resolve, either the last remnant of a civilization or the last chapter of one. The war, if you want to call it that, started with a mistake. I have read the original incident file so many times I can recite it without looking. A Vencall colony tender, the Ardith Morvain, crossed into the Cassivar buffer zone, running a distress signal on a frequency we hadn't catalogued yet. The patrol commander at Outpost Delvith, a man named Soren, who I understand now drinks heavily and doesn't sleep well and hasn't since, read the transmission as an attack ping and fired 2 warning volleys. The Ardith Morvain was a civilian vessel carrying 412 colonists. It was also carrying the royal family of the Vencall's second house. The warning volleys weren't, as it turned out, warnings. The word for what followed is disproportionate. The Bureau used the word necessary, which is a different word that means something entirely different, and has always bothered me in the exact way that a wrong note bothers someone with good pitch. The Vencall had 9 settled worlds and a loose federation of transit stations and a population that I've never been given an official figure for because the Bureau's accounting of it is still classified at a level above my clearance. What I know is what came after. 11 ships. 11 ships and whatever they could carry, running in whatever direction had the most distance between them and the Consolidation Bureau's response. Fleet. They had been running for 3 years before they assigned me to track them. I came to the posting the way most people come to the postings nobody wants, through a combination of bad timing and an obscure qualification that suddenly became relevant to someone with a problem to solve. 6 months before the Ardith Morvain incident, I had put in for a language certification in Vencall trade dialect. This was not a strategic career decision. It was a practical one. I had been stationed at Delvith Station for 2 years at the time, and there was a merchant named Orev, a human, which surprised people, but he'd been trading across the buffer for 15 years and had the parrot disposition of a man who found paperwork more dangerous than frontier commerce, who would share a table and a drink in the station bar and talk about the Vencall settlements in a way that made me want to understand what he was describing. He had the habit of slipping into trade dialect when the standard equivalent ran short. After 8 months of sitting across from him twice a week, I put in for the certification more or less to formalize what I'd already picked up. The certification sat in my file unused until some junior administrator in Remnant Pursuit noticed it and decided I was the Bureau's expert. I was not an expert. I was a man who could count to 20 in trade dialect and ask where the water was, and at a stretch explain that my ship had a mechanical problem. By the time I had been tracking the column for 10 months, I was reading their internal communications without the translation delay. By the time I had been tracking them for 3 years, I was dreaming in trade dialect on the bad nights, which is the specific kind of fluency nobody puts in a report. That was the thing nobody in the Bureau anticipated, and nobody wanted them to anticipate. Because the implications were uncomfortable. When you track a people for long enough, when you learn the rhythm of their broadcasts, and the cadence of their arguments, and the shape of their grief, and the specific way they name their dead, they stop being a threat assessment. They become people. This is obvious to say and hard to live with, and I have never found a way to describe it that makes it less true. The column was led by Queen Sareth Ven Call, last surviving member of the Ven Call First House bloodline. She had been the third-ranking royal at the time of the Ardith Morvain incident, which is how she survived. She was aboard the command tender, Ardith Vane, running a maintenance inspection on the primary drive coupling when the volleys hit. She had been 18 years old. 7 years later, she was 32, and she was the column's head of state, its commanding officer, its chief negotiator with a bureau that had never answered a single formal communication she sent, its primary grief counselor in the periods after mass casualties, and its most visible symbol of the possibility that this ended some way other than badly. I say all of this to give you a sense of what I was actually doing in that monitoring station for 7 years. Not tracking a threat, tracking a person who had been given an impossible task on the worst day of her life, and had been executing it, day by day, without the luxury of stopping. I was 25 when they assigned me to the column. I have done my best reconstruction, looking back, of the moment I understood that my projections were going to be consistently inaccurate. It was in the 8th month. I had a clean firing solution, the first real one, and the column was in an identifiable position that the response fleet could have closed in 18 hours. I sat with the projection data for 6 hours. I filed it with a navigational error that pushed the intercept window out by 15 hours. When the response fleet arrived at the corrected coordinates, the column had moved on. The Bureau logged it as environmental interference. I logged it the same way. I have done this enough times in the years since that I have stopped counting, which is its own answer to the question of what kind of man does this and keeps doing it for 7 years. What I can tell you is what I heard. In year 2, the column lost their first ship, the Ardith Cultivar, a colony liner carrying 800 people, to a reactor failure they couldn't repair with the materials they had. I know, from the communications I monitored, that Queen Sareth made the call herself on when to evacuate the Cultivar. I know she stayed on the channel for the entire evacuation. I know that 112 people did not make it off before the reactor went, and that she did not close the channel until 2 hours after. The last signal died, sitting in the command room of the Ardith Vane, saying the Vencall prayer for the dead, which is a long prayer, into an open frequency in the hope that it carried. It carried, I heard it. I did not file a report that week. In year 3, they lost 2 more ships within 4 months of each other. One to hull failure, one to what I can only describe as despair, which is not an official cause of loss, but is what the record says when a crew of 600s simply stops making the repairs and the vessel falls behind the column and doesn't respond to communication. I have thought about those 600 people many times, and I have never been able to sit with the thought for very long. In year 4, a fever moved through the column. It started on the Sareth's Mercy, the colony liner named after the Queen who had been keeping it flying on will, power, and improvisation for 3 years, and it spread across 5 vessels through the shared air recycling intakes before the chief medical officer on the Ardith Vane, a woman called Dara Ven, who I could pick out of a group communication by voice, identified the pathogen and developed a protocol. They did not have enough of the relevant supplies to treat everyone. The column lost 611 people over 8 weeks. I monitored the end-of-week communications during that period. Every week, Queen Sareth read names. I filed my reports that month on time because I wasn't capable of being tactical about it. I just listened. In year 4, Month 3. I made a monitoring error. A small one. A feedback interval in my surveillance protocol that shouldn't exist unless the operator has adopted the target's own transmission standards as the base layer. Which I had, because it made the monitoring more accurate, and I had not thought carefully enough about what the signal would look like from the other side. Heveth Dower, chief engineer of the Ardeth Vane, found it. He was looking for the source of a background resonance that was showing up in their communications array. And he found, instead, evidence of a human monitoring officer who had learned Venn call transmission protocols well enough to use them as the architecture for his own surveillance. I did not know any of this until much later. What I know now is that Heveth Dower took his finding to Queen Sereth and told her that their shadow had been listening in their own frequency. The Queen asked him what he made of it. He told her, "A man who bothers to learn your language in order to listen more clearly is either intelligence, which is one thing, or something else entirely, which is another." He told her he thought it was the second option, and he wanted to find out. He suggested they let me keep finding them. He suggested they keep talking. He suggested, specifically, that they not change the personal log transmission protocols, which is how personal entries from a monitoring officer in the outer, Cassivar, reach the Ardeth Vane's communications array every time. I forgot to double-check my encryption settings, which was more often than I would like to admit now that I know. This is how Queen Sereth Venn Call came to know the name of my daughter. This is how the children of the Ardeth Vane came to know the silhouette of Plot, my courier ship, which they drew on the corridor wall in pigment because they had decided it was a thing worth drawing. This is how I spent 3 years transmitting carefully encrypted private log entries into the ears of the last civilization I was supposed to be helping to end. The monitoring station where I worked was not a large facility. It was designed for a 2-person crew and had been occupied by 1 person, which is me, for the last 4 years after my partner rotated out to a different posting. It had an observation port that looked into the Cassivar Reach, and on the nights when I couldn't sleep, which was most nights during the second transit window, because something about the specific resonance of the station's drive idling hum was wrong in a way that kept me awake. I would sit at the port and write log entries about the way the Reach looked from that angle. Amber and gray and very still. The kind of still that has depth to it, the way a held breath has depth. The kind of sky that makes you feel that somewheres inside all that silence there is a very large answer to a question you haven't quite figured out how to ask. I wrote those entries for myself, mostly. Also for Veth. My daughter's name is Veth. She was 9 when I took the posting. She is 16 now, and I know her mostly through correspondence and the specific grief of watching someone grow up in letters. I told her about the Cassivar Reach. I told her the Reach was amber and gray and still, and that it looked the way patience looks when patience is a place instead of a quality. She wrote back that this sounded like something a person who was very lonely would say about a very lonely sky, and she was 12 at the time, and the letter made me laugh in a way I hadn't expected, and I kept it. I wrote the letters, and I wrote the log entries, and I went about my work with the careful inaccuracy that had kept 8 ships alive. And 4 years ago, without knowing, I start sending it all straight to the Ardeth Vane. The encirclement order came on a Thursday. I was writing to Veth, halfway through a sentence about the second transit window and why it made sleep difficult, when the priority notification opened on my communications array. I read it twice. I sat with it for the length of time it took me to understand that the second tracker's projections had been accurate enough to close the 15-hour gaps I'd been building into my own, and that this meant the window I'd been carefully maintaining for 7 years had just closed. 3 response fleet divisions. 48 hours. Prisoner processing following successful interdiction. I read the rider about prisoner processing 4 times. Each time it said the same thing. There is a particular quality to bureaucratic language when it is describing something that it would prefer not to describe directly, and that quality was all over the rider. Prisoner processing. For the last queen of a dead civilization, and 8 ships full of people who had been surviving the unsurvivable for 7 years. I sat at my console for a long time. Then I opened a channel to Bureau Command and submitted a formal request for authorization to board the Ardith Vane under a ceasefire framework, ahead of the encirclement. I dressed it in language about operational efficiency and casualty minimization. I cited my language assets and my 7 years of column familiarity. I made it sound like a tactical decision, which in one sense it was, because the best tactics I had left were the ones I hadn't played yet. The request went through in 11 hours with a notation that called me the Bureau's diplomatic representative for this operation, which is not a title I had ever held, and is not one I expect to hold again. I went in a single-seat courier, alone, with nothing I'd brought specifically as a weapon. The approach was 40 minutes. I had tracked this ship for 7 years from monitoring screens, and I had never been within 2,000 kilometers of it. And coming in at 200 meters with the Cassivar Reach spread out behind it was the kind of experience that reorganizes your sense of what things mean. The Ardith Vane was battered in the way that things are battered when they have been repaired many times by people who cared about keeping them alive. Every hull patch was a decision someone had made to keep going. Every improvised fixture was an argument that the vessel and the people inside it were worth the labor. It was not a pretty ship. It was a ship that had lasted, which is a different kind of beauty, and in my view, the more durable one. They let me dock without challenge. I had expected a quarantine, possibly restraints, at minimum a full inspection protocol. What I got was 4 soldiers in mismatched armor who looked at me with the Vencall expression that sits between assessment and acknowledgement, and a woman with a scar across her jaw who said, in First House dialect, "We know who you are," and stepped aside. They walked me through the ship without restraints. The interior had the quality of a place that has been lived in hard and cared for harder. Every surface showed the years in it. The replaced paneling, the jury-rigged lighting where original fittings had been cannibalized, the carefully maintained seals around sections that had taken stress damage and been reinforced manually. But it was clean. It was orderly, in the way that things are orderly when the people who maintain them understand that order is not a luxury but a form of insistence on dignity. I stopped in one of the corridors because I didn't mean to, and then couldn't make myself keep walking. The wall there was covered in drawings, children's work, done in some kind of pigment on the bare metal, bright despite everything. Stars, shapes I recognized as Vencall constellation names, which I knew from their broadcast teaching sessions for the children, which I had monitored for 4 years. And in the middle of the drawings, slightly larger than the others, a rendering of a courier ship. The registration marks were not quite right. Whoever drew it had been working from memory or description rather than direct observation. But the silhouette was right. The specific angle of the drive housing, the proportionate size of the cockpit viewport, the shape that I knew from the outside of the vessel I had been flying for 7 years. They had drawn my ship on their wall. I stood there for longer than I should have. The soldier with the scarred jaw waited without rushing me. I kept walking. The command room was at the vessel's center, the Cassivar, which translates approximately as the heart place, the room the ship's architecture is built to protect. It was smaller than the space implied by the Ardith Vane's external dimensions, and the screens were active, the console work running, the quiet operational hum of a vessel that is always ready to move. In the middle of it, with her back to me and her hands at her sides, looking at a navigational display showing the Cassivar Reach approach from the column's current position, was Queen Sereth Vencall. She turned when I entered. The soldiers who had escorted me stayed outside. We were alone in the heart place of the last ship of her civilization. And she looked at me with an expression I spent the first several seconds trying to identify before I understood what it was. Not hostility, not wariness, not relief, though there was something of that underneath. Recognition. the specific recognition of seeing in person someone you have known at a remove for a long time, the small recalibration of a face you've imagined becoming a face in the room with you, she said. In First House dialect, Warrant Officer Corin, I had not told the soldiers my name. Then she said in standard, accented but precise, with the careful enunciation of someone who has prepared the words, "We have been hoping you would come," I said. "How long have you known that you speak our language?" She considered it with the deliberateness of someone choosing which true thing to say first. 4 years and 3 months. You made an error in your monitoring protocols in the 3rd year. A feedback interval that should not exist unless the operator is using our own transmission standards as the base layer. Heveth Dower found it. 4 years. They had known for 4 years that I could hear everything. They had kept talking. They had kept naming their dead in their open broadcasts, and arguing about power allocation and telling the children the constellation stories in the old dialect. They had kept transmitting the personal teaching sessions and the weekly prayer cycles and the long, tired, honest conversations between officers in the late watch. They had done all of this knowing I could hear it because Haveth Dor had told his queen that the man listening in their own frequency was either intelligence or something else, and she had decided to find out which. I made other errors as well, I said. Yes, she said. We catalogued them. Something moved through me that I did not immediately have a name for. Later I understood it as the specific feeling of being seen, doing something you thought you were doing quietly, and finding out the quiet had been witnessed, and finding that the witness had understood what they were seeing and kept it to themselves for 4 years. Sit down, she said. There are things I want to tell you while there is still time to tell them. I sat. She took the chair across from me, equals position, in Venn call protocol, the seating of 2 people who are speaking at the same level. And she talked, and I listened. She told me about the Ardith Morvain, from where she had been standing when it happened. Not the Bureau's account, which I knew in detail, but the experience of it. Where she was, the specific quality of the silence that came through the channel after the volleys. The 23 minutes before anyone could confirm what had happened. The way those 23 minutes have never fully left her. Because you done, come back from certain kinds of waiting. She was 18. She was the 3rd-ranking royal and the only one who survived because she had been in the wrong place, which turned out to be the right place, which is the specific cruelty of that kind of survival. She told me about the 1st year. The formal diplomatic communications sent to Bureau Command, drafted by her advisors in precise standard, requesting acknowledgement of the Ardith Morvain as an error and proposing a ceasefire framework. 23 communications in 11 months. Every one of them logged and filed and never answered. Not refused, never answered, which she told me is a specific kind of contempt. The contempt that doesn't bother to close the door because it doesn't think you're worth the gesture. She told me about the 2nd year, sauced, when the columns stopped believing the communications would be answered, and about the shift that happened in that period, the way you stop organizing yourself around the hope of rescue and start organizing yourself around the fact of survival. She described it without self-pity and with a clarity that told me she had thought about it a great deal and reached some kind of peace with the distinction, which is its own form of grief. She told me about the 3rd year and the losses in it, which I had monitored, but hearing from her was different from listening from 2,000 kilometers. She talked about the 600 people who died of the fever in year 4, said each ship's count aloud, the way she had said them in the weekly broadcast, and I understood from the cadence that she was doing it the way she always did it, as a practice, as a refusal to let the numbers be only numbers. She told me about Heveth Dower finding my monitoring error and the conversation they had about it afterward. She told me what she had said to him when he showed her the evidence, that a human officer who had learned their frequency architecture in order to listen better was either a threat or something else, and that she was inclined to believe the second, but was not naive about it. and that she wanted to know which it was before she made any decision. She told me about the watching that followed, the careful cataloging of my intercept projections, the noting of the consistent small errors, the slow accumulation of evidence that Heveth Dor was right. "He called you our shadow," she said. "He meant it with some warmth. He is a man who respects patience." I asked about the personal logs. I had worked out by now what had happened with the encryption settings, and I wanted to hear her say it directly. She looked at me for a moment with the composed expression of someone who has decided to be honest about something slightly uncomfortable. Heveth Dor told me that the personal transmission protocols were on the same carrier frequencies as the monitoring array and were therefore, in his view, technically accessible under our existing intercept standards. A slight pause. "He is a thorough man." "He is," I said. "I had 4 years of evidence for this. I should tell you," she said, "that we were not certain for the first several months whether the personal entries were deliberate, whether you were leaving them accessible on purpose as a form of communication. I hadn't been. It had been a genuine oversight. But when I thought about it, sitting in the heart place of the Ardeth vein, with the Kassavar reach visible through the viewport and the star chart turning slowly, I understood that the distinction might not matter as much as I'd assumed. Whether deliberate or accidental, something had crossed. Something had been heard that was meant to be heard, even if the mechanism was unintentional. "Your daughter," she said. "Veth." My throat did something. "We gave her a Ven call name," she said quietly. "The children did. They do this for people they decide matter. It is a practice from before the running, a way of including someone in the community without requiring them to be present. They called her Caldeth. She said the word with care, the way you say a name that belongs to someone. It means, approximately, the one waited for. The one who is not here yet but who is expected. In Venkal social structure, a name given by the community's children is not a casual thing. It is the children deciding that someone is part of the future they are planning. I sat with the weight of that for a long moment and did not trust my voice enough to speak. When I had it back, I said, "What is the Venkal word for someone who comes to stand on the wrong side of a line?" She considered it. "We don't make that distinction in the way you mean it," she said. "There is no Venkal equivalent of wrong side. There is only Kaldavar, the side where the people you belong to are. If those people are in the wrong place, you are in the wrong place with them, and that is not a judgment. That is only a location." A pause. "For the case where a person understands that their people are in the wrong place and crosses to the right one, we have a different word. It is a long word. I will not make you try to pronounce it now." Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, but the quiet predecessor of one. "It means the one who comes home late, but comes." The Bureau's channel opened at 31 hours and 14 minutes. Bureau Commander Lesath had the expression of a senior administrator who has just been kept waiting slightly longer than his patience allows for. "Corin, status report." I gave it to him, all of it. The column's condition, the absence of hostile configuration, the children, the medical situation, the functioning sovereign government, Queen Sareth's name and her title, and her house, the 48 hours of direct contact. I gave him the formal request for rescission of the encirclement order. I cited the Ardeth Morvain incident file by its official designation and stated that the original classification of the Ven call as hostile had been an error, and the Bureau's response had been disproportionate and unlawful. I said all of this on a live channel in a transmission that would be logged as part of the official record by 17 different Bureau administrative systems before Lesath could decide what to do about it. He said very quietly, "Corin, you understand what you're doing?" "Yes," I said. "I do." I closed the channel. The hum of the Ardeth vein was different from inside than it had been in recordings. Warmer. The quality of a sound that has been present long enough to become ordinary, to become the specific texture of home. I sat with my hands on the console and listened to it and thought about the response fleet commanders, reading my transmission and calculating what their names on a strike order would mean in a review proceeding, which was now something that would happen because it was in the record. Some of them would hold. Some of them would decide the calculation was not worth the name. I didn't know which ones or how many. I had given everything I had, and the rest was outside my hands, which is a condition I have never been comfortable with and was not comfortable with. Now but had learned, over 7 years of carefully inaccurate projections, to live inside. Behind me I heard Sareth take a slow breath. Not relief, not yet. The breath before the possibility of relief. She said, "The fleet commanders. Some of them will hold," I said. A live transmission from a diplomatic representative is a different thing to fire past than a clean strike order. They will have to want to do it more than they want to avoid the review. Some of them won't want it that badly. I paused. And the Bureau will have to open a review now. It's on record. There are people who've been filing requests for that review for years. Journalists, historians, former Delveth personnel. They didn't have an officer on record to cite. And after the review, she said, that takes time. Years, probably. Long enough for the political situation to shift if enough noise is made about the original incident file. I looked at the star chart. I have documentation. 7 years of it. I can name every ship you lost and give the date and the cause. I can produce records of every formal communication the column sent to Bureau Command that was logged and not answered. I kept copies of all of it on my own archive because I had a feeling I would want them eventually. I paused. I had a feeling for about 5 years. I kept copying the files. She was quiet for a moment. The star chart turned. The Cassivar Reach, amber and gray, held still. And you, she said. What happens to you? Dismissed, I said. Charged, probably. The dereliction case is straightforward. They will find the navigational errors, and they will not believe they were accidental, which they weren't, and there will be a proceeding. I thought about it. I have a daughter who is 16 and has been waiting for her father to come home for 7 years. I think whatever happens after this, at least I will be somewhere she can find me. Sareth looked at me with those copper gold eyes, and I watched something in her face do what I can only describe as settle. The way the last piece of a long-carried weight settles when you set it down, and the body understands for the first time what it has been holding. Her eyes were wet but composed. They held the years in them. All of them. 11 ships that became 8, 611 names read aloud on the weekly broadcast, 47 children who had grown up drawing the silhouette of the human who moved slowly on the walls of their corridor. She stood. In Ven Call protocol, when a sovereign stands in the presence of someone who has just done what I had just done, there is a specific gesture. I knew it from the cultural records I had spent 4 years reading alongside the communications, monitoring, late-watch reading when the second transit window kept me awake. I had not expected to ever see it outside those records. She stood, and she placed her right hand flat against her sternum. Not a formal gesture, not a ceremonial one, but the Ven Call physical language for this person is inside the protected space. And she said, in standard, in my language, in the 2 words she had prepared, welcome home. Not a greeting, not a sentiment. The thing she had told me the word meant, the one who comes home late, but comes. She had chosen my language to say it in, because she had thought about it, and decided that this particular recognition should be delivered in the language of the person being recognized. I understood that she had been thinking about this for some time, perhaps since Heveth Dar first brought her the monitoring error 4 years ago. Perhaps since the first navigation delay she had noticed was too consistent to be accidental. Perhaps since some late watch when she had been listening to a private log entry from a monitoring officer who couldn't sleep because the second transit window hum was wrong, and had understood something about the nature of the man on the other end of the frequency. I stood up. In Ven Call protocol, when a person stands in the presence of a sovereign without bowing, it means they are claiming equal standing, not a challenge, a statement of what kind of conversation this will be from here. She looked at me and nodded once. The acknowledgement of equal standing received. We sat back down, side by side this time, the seating arrangement that in Vencall custom means beside, not across, which is the difference between conversation and alliance. The star chart turned in front of us. Somewhere in the response fleet, commanders were finishing their read of my transmission. Somewhere in Bureau Command, an administrator was opening the review request that was now in the official record, and could not be made to not be there. Somewhere in the corridor of the Ardeth Vane, children's drawings of a courier ship held still on a metal wall. I thought about Veth. I thought about call death, which means the one waited for, the one expected. I thought about Heveth Dower, who I could pick out of a group conversation by voice, who had told his queen that patience was worth something, and who was, according to the queen, very much looking forward to an overdue conversation. "Tell him I owe him one," I said. Sereth glanced at me, and, for the first time, I saw something that was not the weight of 7 years, but something under it. The thing that was still alive there, despite all of it. A small, tired, genuine lightness. "He will say you owe him several," she said. "He has been keeping a list." Outside the Ardeth Vane, the Cassavar Reach held still. Amber and gray and very still, the way I had described it to my daughter in 100 letters, the way patience looks when it is a place instead of a quality. 8 ships sat between 2 dying stars, and the answer to a 7-year question was taking shape in the silence, slow and careful, the way things take shape when the people building them have learned to be patient with the distance between where they are and where they are going. We sat together and waited for it. I want to tell you about the second transit window, because it is relevant to what happened and because I have never told anyone who would understand why it matters. The Cassavar Reach runs 2 transit windows per standard cycle, periods when the gravitational geometry between the outer stars opens navigation, corridors that are otherwise impassable. The first window runs for about 6 hours, clean and predictable, and you can set a ship through it by the numbers without thinking. The second window is different. It lasts 11 hours, and it runs at an irregular interval, and something about the Reach's specific stellar configuration during the second window produces a resonance in the background radiation that affects the monitoring station's drive idle hum in a way that is just wrong enough to notice, and just subtle enough that you keep waking up wondering what changed. I do not sleep well during the second transit window. I never have, the entire 7 years. What this means, practically, is that there are 11 hours out of every few days when I am awake and the Reach is open, and I have nothing to do but sit at the observation port and write letters to my daughter, and listen to the column's broadcasts, which continue regardless of the hour, because 8 ships on a continuous watch rotation do not observe the same clock as one monitoring officer who cannot sleep. This is how I know, among other things, that Queen Sereth also has difficulty sleeping during certain hours. I have heard her walking the corridor of the Ardeth Vane's command section at what my clock reads as late, and the column's clock reads as whatever. It is in a vessel that has been traveling for 7 years, and no longer observes the calendar of the worlds it left. I have heard her talking to the night watch officers in the Vencall equivalent of small hours conversation, not about logistics or strategy, but about ordinary things. The weather on one of the worlds she grew up on, the name of a constellation that is no longer visible from their current position but was visible from her bedroom window when she was a child. A very long argument, conducted over several evenings, about the correct way to prepare a specific type of food that exists in Vencall cuisine and that no one in the column has had access to for 7 years, which made the argument simultaneously absurd and completely understandable. I wrote in a log entry once. This was in year 5, and I had not yet realized the entries were accessible on the carrier frequency. That the Vencall Queen and I apparently share the same problem with the same hours, which gives us at least one thing in common, even if she doesn't know it, and that there is something both lonely and oddly companionable awake with someone who doesn't know you're awake with them. She told me, sitting in the Kethavar, that she had read that entry 6 times. I asked her what she had thought of it. She said, "I thought that if the man tracking us understood loneliness well enough to describe it that way, he probably also understood enough about why we were running that the loneliness was not accidental." I didn't have a response to that. It was accurate. There were things I knew about the column that I had not put in any report and had not told anyone, and will now tell here, because they are part of the record that should exist and doesn't yet. I knew that they had a school. The Ardith Vane and the 2 largest remaining colony ships each ran a regular educational cycle for the children of the column, taught by adults who had been in the lives they lived before the running. Teachers and engineers and medical officers, and one woman who had been, according to her own introduction at the start of every session, a professional musician. I do not have her name. I never learned it. But I have heard her voice often enough that I would know it in a crowd, and she taught the children music during the second transit window, which meant that on the bad nights when I couldn't sleep and the reach was open and the hum of the station was wrong, I also had, occasionally, the sound of children learning to sing in Vencall First House dialect, which is a language that was built for singing and sounds like it. I knew that they held a seasonal gathering, once per Vencall year, which does not correspond to a standard year, but which the column had maintained. On their own internal calendar, all 7 remaining ships held position in a close formation, and the column conducted what I can only describe as a celebration. Not a military exercise. A celebration, music and food, and the reading of communal records and the telling of stories. I know this because I have the audio from 6 of these gatherings in my personal archive. I know that in year 5, the year after the fever, the celebration lasted 3 days instead of 1, because, the Queen explained in her opening address, the people who were not there deserved 3 days. I knew that they had been maintaining a record of their own history since the first year. A designated historian, an older man named Tavar Ven, who had been a scholar before the running and had apparently decided that his job was still his job regardless of the circumstances, made a weekly broadcast to the column's internal channel summarizing the events of the preceding 7 days. I have transcriptions of all of them. They are detailed, scrupulously accurate to what Tavar Ven could observe, and written in a style that assumes the existence of a future reader who will need to understand what happened and why. He wrote as if history was already being read from the other side of time, which is, I think, the correct way to write it. In year 6, Tavar Ven mentioned me in the weekly record, not by name. He described in 3 careful sentences a pattern of navigational delays in Bureau response fleet deployments that the column had noted across a 4-year period, and stated that the column had no confirmed explanation for the pattern, but that the historian's personal assessment was that intentional interference by a person of conscience within the Bureau could not be ruled out, and that if such a person existed, the historical record should note that their contribution to the column's survival was considerable. He said this in a weekly broadcast that I received on my monitoring array on a Tuesday morning, and I replayed it twice to make sure I had the words right. And then I sat at my console for a while, doing nothing in particular, while the Cassavar reach held still outside the viewport, and the hum of the station heat did its wrong note thing, and the second transit window ran its 11 hours out. Around me. I did not file a report that week. I told Sarath about this in the Kethavar, and she nodded slowly and said that Tavar Ven was, in her view, the most accurate historian the Vencall had produced in 2 generations, which she meant as a high compliment, and that he was also a man who put everything in the record that he believed deserved to be there, regardless of whether it was convenient. She said this with a quality of fond exasperation that I recognized as the expression of a person describing someone who is sometimes difficult and always right. There was a particular afternoon in year 5, late in the year, after the fever losses, during a period when the column had made a hard course correction that pushed them into a slow transit arc between 2 unstable stellar bodies, when, I tracked them to a position that offered what would have been the cleanest interdiction window in 2 years. I sat with that projection for 4 hours. The math was unambiguous. The Bureau's response fleet, properly positioned, could have closed the column in 12 hours, with a closing probability of 91%. I spent 4 hours finding a navigational error that was plausible, defensible, and large enough to push the window out by 18 hours. It was the most technically demanding falsification I had committed in the entire 7 years, because the window was so clean that a substantial error was required. And a substantial error required more explanation than a subtle one. I filed it. The Bureau logged it. The response fleet missed the window. What I remember about that afternoon is sitting at the console after I filed the report and being very tired. Not the tired that comes from physical effort or lost sleep. The tired that comes from a particular kind of ongoing work that you do alone and can't tell anyone about, and that you're not certain is right in any ultimate sense, but that you can't stop doing because the alternative is worse in a way you can't argue yourself past. I sat at the console, and I was very tired, and the Cassivar Reach was amber outside the viewport, and I thought about Tavar Venn noting a pattern of delays in his weekly record and writing 3 careful sentences to say that a person of conscience might be responsible. He didn't know he was right. He was being careful and accurate, in the way historians are careful and accurate when they don't have confirmation. But he had looked at the pattern and decided it was worth recording. And he had decided that if there was a person on the other end of it, the record should say so. This is what I mean when I say I was being seen. I came to understand, in the 2 hours before I boarded the Ardith Vane, and in the hour I spent walking to the Cathaver through the ship's corridors, that what had been happening for 4 years was not simply surveillance from their side, to balance the surveillance from mine. It was the column deciding, carefully and deliberately, and with the specific patience of a people who have learned not to rush their assessments, that Dale Corrin was worth knowing. They had read my letters to my daughter. They had heard my log entries about the Cassivar Reach. They had listened to me sit awake during the second transit window and describe patience as a place rather than a quality. They had drawn my courier ship on the wall of their children's corridor. They had decided somewhere in years 3 and 4 and 5 that I was going to come eventually. That the person whose intercept projections were consistently and defensively wrong was the kind of person who would eventually get in a courier ship and come. Sareth told me this directly, late in our conversation, after she had told me about Tavar Venn and the weekly record. She said, "We were patient because we believed you would come. We did not know when. We did not know what circumstances would bring you. We knew that the man we were reading in the log entries was working towards something, and that it would resolve in one direction or the other, and we decided to be here when it did." I asked her what she would have done if I hadn't come. If the encirclement had closed without my request, without my transmission, without me in a courier ship asking to board. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the star chart. "We would have held our position," she said, "as long as possible, and the historians would have put it in the record. 7 years of running, and what she was describing was not defiance exactly, or maybe it was, but the kind of defiance that doesn't perform itself, the kind that simply keeps the record and keeps the school running and keeps the music sessions during the second transit window and keeps the seasonal gathering for 3 days in the year of the fever losses. Because the people who are not there deserved 3 days. The kind of defiance that draws a courier ship on the wall because it belongs there. The column had survived 7 years of the unsurvivable on the daily practice of deciding that their lives and their history and their children, their grief all deserved to be treated as real. That is the specific thing the Bureau could not account for in their threat assessments, because threat assessments don't have a category for the stubborn dignity of a people who simply refuse to let the record be silent. The channel from Bureau Command opened, and I gave my report and closed the channel, And after I closed it, there was the long waiting. I am not good at waiting. I have spent 7 years cultivating patience, and I am still not good at it. The Ven call, I think, are better. Sareth sat beside me, with the quality of a person who has been waiting a long time, and has learned what shape to hold herself in while the answer takes its time arriving. I thought about my daughter. I thought about writing her a letter, and realizing I didn't know what to say about this. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. And I didn't know which part of it was the part that would explain anything. I thought about the fact that she had a Ven call name given to her by children who had never met her and probably never would. A name that meant the one waited for, and that this was true in a way that had nothing to do with the column, and was somehow also exactly about the column. I had been waiting for 7 years to figure out what I was going to do. She had been waiting for 7 years to have her father back. We had been waiting in the same direction without knowing it. I thought about Heveth Dower, who I would meet shortly, and about what I was going to say to him. A person can listen to someone argue about power allocation for 2 years and feel like they know the shape of them, and I knew that Heveth Dower was methodical and principled, and had a tendency to reach the right conclusion early and spend a long time being patient while everyone else caught up to it. I had watched him be right about 3 major engineering decisions that the Ardith Vane's other officers resisted and then accepted, and I had watched him make his case each time in the same way, calmly, precisely, without drama, waiting for the evidence to do what evidence does when you give it time. He was a man who respected patience because he practiced it himself, and he had told his queen 4 years ago that the human tracking them was worth watching because the errors were too consistent to be accidents and too small to be sabotage. He had been right, and he had been patient, and in 31 hours I was going to shake his hand for the first time. Sareth said quietly, "The fleet is holding position." I looked at the navigation display. The Bureau Response Fleet's transponder signals, which I knew how to read from 7 years of watching them from the other side, were stationary, not advancing, not withdrawing, holding. It was not a decision. It was a pause before a decision, which in a fleet command situation means that the commanders are in communication with each other and with Bureau Command, and they are all doing their individual calculations about what their names on a strike order mean in the context of a live channel diplomatic transmission from the Bureau's own representative. The pause would not last forever. But it was there, which meant the calculation was happening, which meant the transmission had landed. I let out a breath I had not entirely known I was holding. "Some of them," Sareth said. "Some of them," I agreed. It was enough. Not a solution. A solution takes time and review proceeding and the slow work of public record and the even slower work of political will. But enough for today. Enough for the 8 ships between the dying stars to still be flying when tomorrow came. The star chart turned. The Cassivar Reach held still. I would be dismissed. The charges would be filed, and I would answer them, and the career I had spent 20 years building would be over, replaced by something else that I did not yet know the shape of. I was not afraid of this in the way I had expected to be afraid of it. There is a particular quality of freedom that comes from having done the thing you couldn't not do, and I was inside that quality now, sitting in the heart place of a ship I had been careful not to catch for 7 years. And whatever came next was going to come from this place, which was the right place. My daughter would have a father who was somewhere she could find him. That was real. Heveth Dower was owed a conversation. That was real. 47 children had drawn a courier ship on a wall in a corridor, and the man whose ship it was had come, which meant that the name Caldeth was true in both directions now. The waited for and the one who arrived. Sareth sat beside me and said nothing for a while, and I said nothing, and the Ardith Vane hummed its warm, rough, lived-in hum, and the second transit window was running somewhere in the Cassivar Reach's geometry, and for the first time in 7 years I didn't mind. Outside, beyond the hull, the Cassivar Reach was doing what it always does, holding still, holding everything that has been left inside it, amber and gray against the deeper dark. There is no one out there to watch it except me, and I have watched it for 7 years, and it has never once looked back. But sitting in the Kethavar, with the hum under my feet and a queen beside me, and the fleet holding position, and 47 names on a wall, that included one that meant the one waited for, I thought that maybe the Reach was not a place that needed to look back. Maybe it was enough that it held still and gave you something to navigate by. Maybe that was all a place like that was asked to be. I would write Veth a letter. I would tell her that the Kassavar Reach, from inside the ship this time, looked the way arrival looks when arrival is a place instead of a moment. Amber and gray and very still. I would tell her I was somewhere she could find me. I would tell her about the name the children gave her and what it meant, and I would let her decide what she thought of it, because she is 16, and she has her own opinions and they are usually right. We waited. The stars held, and the long answer kept taking shape.